Hi guys, Professor O'Brien here with a brief introduction to Neurolinguistics for the English 2020 Language and Technology course. And I'm beginning on page 277 of the Linguistics for Dummies text. And I'm hopefully, I'll open with the connection. We're interested in neurolinguistics mostly because in the last 30 or 40 years, there have been extraordinary technological advances which allow us to examine the brain as it processes language. Now, your everyday linguist will be interested in what the brain is doing with language, simply out of curiosity and perhaps to develop new apps or new technologies which might be able to more accurately reflect what the brain is doing with language. So for instance, you can do a hunt on the internet for yourself. There's a linguist in, I want to say Toronto, who has come up with a basic mind reading device, which basically uses EEG to figure out what words the brain is thinking and translating them into language. That's quite extraordinary, I think. Anyway, your brain does different things and uses different areas of the brain according to whether you're speaking, listening, reading, writing, or thinking about language. And we're interested in finding out what parts of the brain are doing what with what. Now, it becomes a much more important field when you think of, for example, stroke victims or children suffering from aphasia or trauma victims who have lost the ability to speak and might need therapy. At that stage, it becomes very important for us to know how the brain works with language if we want to get language abilities back. Now, I'm using my own little cheat sheet here to direct me here, and I'm on to page 278, the first part of this lecture, where we're talking about normal, healthy brains and how they work. Now, I'll jump straight on to the grade box in the second half of page 278, simply because this indicates what we knew from about the 19th century on, that the brain consisted of grey matter and white matter. Now, we weren't entirely sure what the difference was. It's only gradually that we've begun to realize that the grey matter is the processing matter of the brain, whereas the white matter is the cabling. It connects the processing areas of the brain with each other. But as the text points out on page 279, it's not quite as clear as that. It's not as if your brain is a printed circuit board with a chip for semantics up here and a chip for syntax down here and a chip for morphology over here. Instead, it's a big mass of neurons. And they're all interconnected. And while we know that certain parts of the brain do certain things, we're not 100% certain exactly what these parts of the brain do. But we will be getting into specialization in a little more. But let's just accept what the text says on page 279. Language, indeed, all brain activity is multilocational. More than one place in the brain is being used when you're processing language, or indeed when you're doing anything. But that should make sense If you turn the page and look at the top of page 280, you'll see kind of a map of the left side of the brain here. Now, the brain is broken, each hemisphere of the brain is broken up into 4 lobes. There's the frontal lobe, then there's the parietal lobe behind that, there's the occipital lobe, which is at the very back, and then underneath them is the temporal lobe. Now, jump to the top of the picture of the brain there, and you will see voluntary motion as a sort of a skinny area at the back of the frontal lobe, or the front of the parietal lobe. Now, this deals with conscious movement. As I move my hand, as I move my fingers, I'm using that part of the left side of my brain. Now, by the way, this is the left hemisphere you're looking at. I am voluntarily moving things. But think about this. When I move my lips, when I move my tongue, when I move my vocal cords, when I take in a breath to expel air so that I can make linguistic sound, I'm also using that part of the brain. But it's not just that part, that's the motor cortex of the brain. I'm also, of course, pulling words from wherever they're being stored. I'm putting them together in order, and I'm changing those words according to whether they're like past tense verbs or in the future tense, or if it's a plural noun or a singular noun, or it's in the possessive. So the brain is using other parts to do all that as well. So that's my point. Linguistic activity is multi-locational, and by the way, it's very hard on the brain. Ask any university lecturer who's been lecturing for an hour, and they will tell you that they are psychologically exhausted at the end, because it isn't just a case of motor activity like a game of soccer. Every part of the brain is in use, particularly if there's an emotional part to the conversation as well, because that pulls in the right hemisphere and it pulls in the frontal lobes. So everything in the brain is lighting up when somebody is conversing. And you may find yourself, after a long conversation, that you're exhausted, and you might wonder, how can I be so tired? I was just talking to someone. Well, it's probably the hardest activity that your brain can take part in. All right. Now, speaking of hemispheres, you'll see on page 280, there's the talk of left hemisphere specialization. The left hemisphere is interested in vocabulary, lexicon, word order, syntax, and word meaning, semantics. In the meantime, however, the right side of the brain deals with pronunciation, phonetics, phonology, how sounds fall together, and emotion, and to a certain extent, language, sensory activities. I'm not so sure about the motor, the reference to motor sensory processes there, but we'll take what the text says. Now, immediately after that, you'll see the text points out that the two hemispheres are communicating with each other all the time. And this, of course, makes perfect sense. The left side of your brain can find as many words as it likes and put them together and organize the grammar in a rational way. But nothing is going to come out until the right side of the brain does some phonological processing. This syllable goes with this syllable, the word comes together, and then it gets sent on for pronunciation. And again, of course, there's another side to this, and that is speech has, well, language rather, has two major sides. Productive, where you're making sounds, and passive, where you are listening to sounds. And they're not necessarily the same things. You can learn. And for instance, I'm sure some of you come from households where another language is spoken, but you might not be able to speak that language, even though you can understand every word of it that's being said to you by your parents. So you have an excellent passive knowledge of the language, but no productive knowledge of the language. Our brains are actually doing two separate things. They're learning to produce language and they're learning to understand language. Anyway, I got slightly off the point there. The two hemispheres interact a great deal. Obviously, they're connecting up using those cabling cells, the white matter of the of the brain, and I don't want to say it's the corpus callosum, but there's an entire mass of tissue between the two hemispheres, which is devoted to communication between the two. Okay, now, how does language work in the brain? Note on page 281, there's a reference to three types of memory. Now, if you own a computer, you're probably aware of the three types of memory yourself. Your microprocessor has what we'll call immediate memory. It might store a number in a certain spot, process it, and send it on. Now, your brain kind of has the same. It has extremely short-term memory so that if syllable A follows syllable, if syllable B follows syllable A, your brain will remember syllable A because it's been stored someplace. Meanwhile, working memory, slightly more long-term in that you might get to the end of a sentence, but where have you stored the start of it? Particularly if you're listening to it. And if it's a long multi-clause sentence like the following, because John's car broke down on the highway, he couldn't get to class on time. Now, where are you storing that initial clause, because John's car broke down on the highway? You're storing it in the working memory. Now, after you move on to the next sentence, that gets discarded. There's no use for it. And then your brain has long-term memory. And this is where your brain stores, for instance, the information for the pronunciation of words. I'm sure you haven't really thought about that. You can learn to pronounce a word without being able to spell it. Where's the pronunciation being stored? And how is it being stored? You all know the word elephant, but where's the pronunciation of that word being stored in your brain? It's unlikely that it's being stored as ELEPHANT, even though you know how to spell the word. You certainly knew how to pronounce the word before you ever saw the word being spelled. So long-term memory stores things like that. It also stores the meaning of the word, of course. So there's no point learning a string like elephant if you don't know what it denotes. So in addition to that pronunciation string that you've memorized, you've also memorized what it means, what it stands for. Now, I said just a moment ago that language is very hard on the brain. It's more or less what the bottom of page 281 is saying as well. It makes intense demands on memory. And there's an interesting analysis of a sentence like, the next bus doesn't stop here, so you'll have to wait until the one at 10 o'clock. There's a great deal going on in the brain for that sentence to make sense. And there's an analysis of what your brain is doing on page 282 as it hears that sentence. Firstly, the signal is being stored temporarily as the sentence works its way through from the start to the finish in short-term memory. It's being analyzed, and your brain has an excellent ability, by the way, to filter non-linguistic noise from linguistic noise, or linguistic noise that isn't relevant to what's going on at the moment, a conversation over there, for instance, and to concentrate on what's being spoken in the immediate situation. The speech signal then gets moved to working memory, that is to say, the whole sentence gets remembered, and then, and only then, long-term memory is accessed. What does that word mean? What does this group of words mean? And of course, that means you're calling on the pronunciation of the word and what it designates. Now, page 283. There's the point here is that language involves more than simply words and pronunciation. There's a great deal of extra linguistic activity as well. So you might not get as much out of this lecture if you couldn't see my face. But are the expressions on my face and the way I use my hands as I speak, are those activities parts of the language process? Are they linguistic? Secondly, how does the brain connect everything up? Now, we're going to be talking a little about Broca's area and Wernicke's area in a few moments, but the text also mentions at the bottom of this page the Geschwind's territory. Norman Geschwind was a neurolinguist in Boston and postulated accurately that there was a great deal of tissue between Broca's area and Wernicke's area that was involved in the ferrying of information to and fro. Now, it's a little more complicated than that, but we're going to call this territory Geschwind's territory. There's an interesting observation in 284 that we only know because we are able to use technology to analyze brain activity. Even when you are reading a book, your brain mimics the process of making language, which is to say, the motor area of your brain is firing very slightly to say p-a-t when you read the word pot, for instance. So it's always working, and there's a certain amount of mirroring of language, even when we're not actually actively producing language. The section between 284 and 285 is all about plasticity. Now, you'll all have heard stories, you might even have a relation who suffered brain damage in some way or other. Let's say a large portion of your left brain gets damaged through trauma. Is it possible to recover? Well, it seems, yes, that it is possible to recover, suggesting that your brain has some sort of an overall map. It can see where the damage has occurred and compensate by bringing in other parts of the brain to take that role. Okay, now I'm jumping on to the second half of the chapter here, well, the second third, I guess, and that is, what about when the brain is damaged? And in fact, it's brain damage which allowed us from the 19th century on to speculate that language activities in the brain were localized. Now, I first want to speak about Broca's aphasia, bottom of page 285 here. And you'll see if you turn back to page 280 that Broca's area is actually indicated just at the very bottom right, or the very bottom rear of the frontal lobe of the left hemisphere of the brain. And seems that people with Broca's aphasia have problems altering the morphology of words or putting words in the right order, but their ability to connect word and meaning remains intact. Now, people suffering from Broca's aphasia, this is if damage has occurred to the area around Broca's area in the brain, do seem to be aware of their problems. They're trying to put the words together in the right order, but they just cannot identify the right order. Or they're trying to put a noun into the possessive, but they can't actually remember or find in time the change that needs to be made. Broca's aphasia is serious, but for the most part, people suffering from Broca's aphasia seem to be still able to make sense of what they hear and express some sensible material themselves. Wernicke's aphasia is much more serious because the brain's ability to connect a series of sounds with a concept appears to be broken. So people suffering from Wernicke's aphasia can make grammatically sensible sentences that don't make any semantic sense at all. And the problem may also be passive. You could say elephant to them. They might even be able to repeat the word back to you, but they won't be able to connect it with the concept elephant. And this is cognitively very frustrating. People suffering from Wernicke's aphasia very often aren't aware of what's happened to them. And it's obviously the only way to explain it to them is using language. And if they can't connect what they're hearing with concepts in the brain, complete frustration ensues. All right. Now, should you be so inclined, do a search on YouTube or similar for Penfield and Jasper at McGill University, and you'll see how early developments in brain surgery allowed us to start looking at localized brain activity with language. Now, you may have seen this dramatized in the movies as well, but a great deal of brain surgery occurs with the patient still awake because the surgeons are keen not to do damage to parts of the brain that are important, obviously. So they will typically probe as carefully as they can to see what the patient is experiencing, remembering, perceiving as they touch areas of the brain with probes. And this, by the way, allowed us for the first time to recognize that the claims that Broca and Wernicke were making in the 19th century were absolutely right. When these areas were stimulated during brain surgery, language was affected in some way or other. Now, this connects very nicely to the next section, which is all about seeing what the brain does as it processes language. Now, technologies such as EEG, that is to say, electroencephalography, or fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imagery, weren't around until the 1960s and 1970s, and they remained in a very primitive form until the 1980s or 90s. Now, with very sensitive technology, we can much more accurately map brain activity, localized brain activity using these. Now, EEG really involves analyzing very subtle changes in electrical activity on the scalp, which is the reason you'll often see these electrodes on the scalp of people who are getting EEGs, or perhaps a little sort of cloth helmet with electrodes with wires attached. Now, all they're interested in doing is finding what parts of the scalp are picking up more electrical activity inside on the surface of the brain and then extrapolating from that what's happening in the brain. fMRI does kind of the same, but is more interested in blood flow. What parts of the brain are using more blood at one moment rather than another? And it's possible now to use fMRI in 3D to see where the brain activity is most obvious. Again, you can do a search yourself on the web for videos of fMRI. You'll be struck by how accurate the fMRI technology has become nowadays in comparison to how it looked in the 80s and 90s. Now, what can we do with this? Well, page 288 shows, introduces us to something we'll be talking about in slightly more detail in a few moments, and that is oddball paradigms. We're interested in seeing how the brain reacts to changes in linguistic environment. You might, for instance, as the text points out, provide a long list of nouns and then slip a verb in and see if the brain activity changes as the listener recognizes, verb, not noun. Now, of course, you're not telling the listener to look out for nouns and verbs. You just slip it in and see if the brain activity, if the detection of the verb is subconscious. Okay, there's a slightly more detailed introduction to EEG and MRI on page 289. You can read that yourselves. But what I would like to draw your attention to is how these technologies can be used to analyze how the brain processes language. So you'll see figure 16.2 on page 290. And it looks ferociously complicated, but it isn't. Take a look at 16.2a. Now, you'll have seen images like the top dark image there earlier in the course. It is simply a depiction, as you'd see in WASP, of language. And below that is the more interesting part, and that is the electrical activity in the brain measured in femtofarads per centimeter, which is just a unit of electrical activity in the brain, like I say. And if you look at the dotted line there, you will see that that's the point where the brain recognizes the oddball. So it's taken approximately 150 milliseconds for the brain to recognize something's wrong here. This isn't the word I was expecting, or this isn't what I was expecting. Now, the second half of that figure, I think, is the more interesting one, because now we have two graphs. You have the hard black line, which is recording or looking out for what we're going to call the N400. And y- uh, the same line looking out for the P600, as it's called. Now, this is just fancy language. The N400 is a fancy way of um, uh, noting that reactions to semantic anomalies occur about 400 milliseconds after the anomaly begins, whereas reactions to syntactic, that is to say, word order or um, yes, we'll just keep it there, word order errors occur about 200 milliseconds later. So using measuring technology like this, we're actually able to distinguish. Our brain is clearly distinguishing between semantic and syntactic anomalies. So I find that quite interesting. Now, very quickly, I just want to speak about priming the brain, the bottom of page 291 there. And this has something to do with the second section there, making use of the whole brain. What we want to do is, when we're experimenting, is to lull the brain into expecting something. That's priming the brain. So I could give you a long list of words connected to the writing process: pen, ink, eraser, notebooks. The brain falls into this rhythm. But then I could throw in donut. Now, having been primed, the brain then sees the anomaly and sounds the alarm. That is going to be a semantic irregularity, so it's probably going to be better reflected in the N400. The section there in page 292 points out also that experimenting like this is very difficult. The experiment has to be repeated scores of times because you can't simply concentrate on language all the time. A bird might be singing on a tree outside the room. You might have an itchy knee. You might have thought of an exciting movie you saw last night. How do we know that the brain activity that we're recording is actually occurring because of linguistic anomalies being presented? So it's interesting to note, as the text points at the bottom of the page there, that people practiced in Buddhist meditation and mindfulness are often better subjects. They seem to be able to concentrate on the task much better. Okay, excuse me. That covers the neurolinguistics lecture. I hope it was useful. You may also have readings in psycholinguistics, and if so, please go ahead and do that yourselves. I don't know if I'll be able to get round to another lecture this week, but at the very least, you now have the neurolinguistics and the psycholinguistics lecture. You'll also see there are two videos to see. One is basically just footage of MRI activity. The other, however, is an excellent documentary about brain damage and how technology can be used to analyze it. And I very strongly recommend that you watch that. It's an excellent adjunct to this lecture. So I wish you a good week, and we'll be talking a little more about this matter when I see you for our next real-time meeting. Goodbye.